married or in a committed relationship looking for real advice on having love and enriching your relationship? You are in the right place. Welcome to The Couples Expert with Stuart Fensterheim.
Hi there, and welcome back to the Couples Expert podcast. This is Stuart Fensterheim, the Couples Expert. Today I have on my show Mickie Zada. Mickie Zada is the owner of a network called Surviving Abuse. She left a 34-year marriage about 15 years ago and is now helping women get out of abusive relationships. I met Mickie at a podcasting conference a while ago, and when we got to talking, I realized that she might have some things to help you all learn how to get out of a abusive marriage and begin the process of healing so that you can have a healthy relationship. So Mickie, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Couples Expert podcast.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm happy to be here.
I wanted to start out with asking you a little bit about your network and a bit about why you got involved in this area of abuse.
Sure. My company is called Surviving Abuse Network, and it is the culmination of me living for 34 years in an domestic abusive situation. I've been out of that for 16 years, and just about 10 months ago, I've gained the confidence and the gumption, I guess, to begin speaking my truth. So I lived in domestic abuse for 34 years. I say I stayed way too long at the dance. And of course, it wasn't always bad. There were a lot of good times. And those of us who live in abuse, those are the things we hang on to. We hang on to the good times, the good guy. And we forget about that evil, nasty, horrible other side as much as we can. It's a game that we play in our heads. And I played it for a long, long time. Actually, for 23 years before I even allowed the concept that I was an abused spouse enter my mind. It was just how life was. And it started out with control. Even before we were married, it started with control. Then it evolved into emotional, financial, and 5 years into the marriage, it became physical abuse. I still stayed. It was just... By that point, I was kind of conditioned that this was our reality and this was my reality, and there was no way out. So that's kind of how I started with surviving abuse. Actually, I have a podcast. I interviewed a woman, and somehow we began a small conversation about domestic abuse. And when I talked to my editor, I said, remove all of that. I want that all out of that podcast. And she said, why? What's going on? I said, I'm not talking about that. And she said, tell me more about what you're saying. I said, I lived in abuse for 34 years. I am not talking about that on a podcast. Well, my new husband was there, and the two of them began talking to me in 2 hours about discussing why I was still not wanting to talk about it. And the fact that that was my reality. About 2 hours into it, tearfully, I said, okay, I will do this. I can do this. It still took me a while. So that just shows the depth of the emotional damage that happens to women who live in abuse. It's, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to relive it. We just bury it. And that's not healthy. I'm going to say that is not healthy, but that's what happens.
That experience you just described, that was 15 years later, right?
That was 15 years later. That's right.
To me, as you say that, it almost brings chills up and down my spine because it definitely shows you the trauma. Even 15 years later, even trauma that we don't even recognize.
Exactly. And I am a very centered, I'm intelligent, but that was a time of my life where I wasn't me. In fact, Stuart, I say, when I was 53 when I finally left my abusive husband, and we'd been married 34 years at that point, and I realized that I did not know who I was. I didn't know what I liked. I didn't know politically what my opinions were. I didn't know what color I like. And when I say that, particularly in groups, people are looking at me like I have 6 heads. But women who live in abuse, that is so typical. I thought I was unique. I thought I was the only person, the only woman in the world who would allow this kind of behavior toward myself. And it's so typical. It is so typical. So it's insipid. Domestic abuse is insipid.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind me asking you this question, but was there physical abuse in your family growing up?
No, that's the amazing thing. There was not.
Which is very, I was actually almost thinking that as you were talking, and there was something about the way you were saying that said that to me. And I think so often people say, well, the reason that people get into these relationships is because they normalize it because they saw it in their family. But this is a much more complicated issue
Yeah.
than that, I think.
Yes, that was not my background. Not at all. There was some of my brothers had dyslexia. Back in the 50s, nobody knew what dyslexia was.
Right.
So I was taught to accommodate some negative behavior from males, from my brothers. But I don't think that was significant enough. I think what happened for me was I was raised in a family with not much money. And this gentleman was raised in a family with lots of money. Every time the kids turned 16, somebody got a brand new car. And he was on a career path that I admired. And I thought, man, that's the life I want. So I kind of walked into this with stars in my eyes, not admitting the control. There were red flags. But again, I was 18 years old. We got married. I say it's a month and 10 days before my 19th birthday. So, like that meant something.
Right.
But I think that was it for me. It was that I saw a bright, shiny future, and I let those bright, shiny things get in my way. And before I knew it, I was cooked. I use the analogy many, many times that if you put a frog in a boiling pot of water, he hits that water, man, he's out of there. But if you put a frog in a cold pot of water and you begin warming it up, he gets cooked. And that's how domestic abuse is. Pretty soon you're cooked and you don't even realize it.
Do you know what's interesting is I recently saw an episode of the show, and a lot of people love this show now, called This Is Us. And This Is Us is the episode was about they're fostering a child that comes from a substance abuse mom. And one of the scenes in that episode has this girl and a friend of hers in a foster home where the foster dad is abusing them. And there's a conversation that this girl has with the character on the show that basically says, you have a warm bed, you have food over your head, and you won't be moved so many times. Just put up with a little bit of violence to you, a little bit of abuse, and you'll get all these good things.
Tragic. It's tragic.
It's really a pervasive issue.
It's exactly
whether
what
you're
happens.
an adult or a child in an abusive environment. It's really that same thing. What we allow other people to do to us just for the sense of safety and security.
Yeah. And it's all baloney. It's all a facade. In my marriage, we owned very lucrative businesses. We worked together every day. And so the facade was tremendous. We lived in a nice big house. I had a diving swimming pool, huge size swimming pool, looked out over a long yard that ended at a lovely lake with a dock and some boats. And that was my life. And our son was raised being able to go to camp in the summertime in private schools and, all the things, nice cars, all those things. And they look like they're perks, but really they're anchors. And I say all the time, I had a sign in my front yard and it said, "I'm fine, thank you very much." but so the picture was beautiful, but the reality was hell.
Right. And I think I hear a lot from some of my own clients where women begin to talk about, well, this is happening to me, but I'm staying because of the kids. I'm staying because my children would end up either in a broken home or they'll end up, with less than. They won't be able to go to college potentially. So I'll just stay and put up with this. How do you help a woman like that has that perspective, which there's a real reality that comes with that?
Well, you know what? I have recently changed my perspective. In my life, my personal life, I stayed. My son was grown and married by the time I left. And I regretted that. I regretted that he grew up in that situation. He was never physically abused by his dad, but he was emotionally abused. And anybody who's had both will tell you emotional abuse is dramatically worse than physical abuse. So I regretted that I stayed because of my son. I thought he needed his dad in his house. And I was sorry that I ever did that because he's not an abuser, thank God. I think it's because I always talked openly with him about his dad's behavior. However, I had an interview with a woman who has children, and she chose to stay in the relationship because her kids would have to spend time alone with their dad if she left.
Right.
And she said, it's worth it to me to have stayed so that I didn't have to panic. I didn't have to worry that I'm not there to protect them. I want to be there to protect them. So she said, I never left. I never thought of it from that perspective. And now that I'm beyond that, it's true. It didn't occur to me that if I left, my son would have to spend whatever time the court said, weekends or holidays or all summer with his dad. And that could have been disastrous and danger and unhealthy. So now I'm kind of caught in the middle. I understand both sides of that equation.
Is it a quick jump to say that if someone's being abused by a man in a relationship, that automatically means he's going to be abusive with the child? I think that's the struggle. We don't know.
We don't know that. And he might, like I said, my husband was not physically abusive with our son, but our son witnessed horrible abuse.
Right. And that's that when we start talking about emotional abuse, it doesn't necessarily mean someone saying mean things to him, but the fact that he would see his mom and dad and the conflicts there. And the thing that I tell a lot of people is part of the question you got to ask yourself, and everyone's got to answer this for themselves, obviously, is that if your child is witnessing this type of behavior in the marriage, and kids we know pretty much emulate the relationship that the parents had, are you then saving this child, or are you putting this child in a situation where potentially we now have another abusive marriage?
I think that that's probably more common. That I call that a program pattern. We learn so many things as we're children. And if we learn that abuse is acceptable, that we're teaching that young man how to treat women, and that's not okay. So the way that I dealt with that, because I think at that point I knew I wasn't going to leave, I talked to my son from the time he was about, I'm guessing he was 9, maybe a little older. I began speaking with him about his dad's behavior. And that it's not okay, that this is who your dad is. And yes, I'm staying here. And yes, I'm putting up with it. But he has issues that you don't have. So you don't, just because it's how he behaves does not mean that this is how you have to behave as an adult. I want you to have more respect for women than that. And we had open conversations. I also stressed that I didn't expect him to be my defender. Mm-hmm. That I didn't want him to become the man of the house or take any responsibility away from his dad's responsibility. I didn't want him to feel like that was becoming his job, because it's not. His job is to be a kid, and unfortunately, his reality was. And that's something that happens too. A lot of times, I have friends and clients that I work with that say, "Well, I want to hide this from my kids." You're not hiding anything. They know.
Right.
They know. And if we don't address the reality, they're going to make their own conclusions. They're going to come to their own conclusions. And that's not healthy. So
could you talk a little bit about this issue of shame? Because as you're talking, what I'm hearing in some of this and sort of how we sort of struggle of facing what the reality is because there's this really huge issue of shame that we feel, isn't it?
Shame and guilt. And the amazing thing is, it goes back to, I thought I was the only woman who was weak enough to tolerate this kind of behavior. And really, every woman who lives in abuse feels the same way. We don't realize that it's such a common thread. And common in that thread is the shame. We know that we're being treated poorly, and we know we don't deserve it on some level, yet we tolerate it, and we make excuses for, and we I've learned since then that we teach people how to treat us. And I put up with it. I didn't draw the line. Now, I didn't draw the line because I thought it would make it worse. So there's a lot of issues in there, but certainly shame and guilt, admitting that this is how I'm living is embarrassing. And that's one reason we don't talk about it. And then it's the guilt of allowing our children to live in that situation. We know it's not okay. On some level, we know it's not okay. But we also have a personality and not enough personal growth involved in our lives, is my opinion, that we aren't willing or able to rock the boat. We continue walking on eggshells.
And I think one of the things I want to make sure that I make a statement about is I really respect what you're doing, because you are making a stand that says no more does this have to go on. No one has to live in this. And if someone doesn't speak out and at least say what's real, talk the reality, people are going to continue to live in these environments. And I think a term that I heard you use a while back was called collective collusion. Mm-hmm. And if you could talk a little bit more about that. But I think that what you're doing with this network is really letting people know there's an alternative.
That's exactly what I'm doing. Collective collusion is so huge. When I was in a mastermind group with survivors of domestic abuse, and one of the things we talked about, and I described it as, it's almost like a fog, an invisible fog that hangs around us, especially when we begin thinking that this is not okay and we're going to leave. And I just described it as a fog. I didn't know what it was. Well, I listened to a lecture by Dr. James Finley, and he used the term collective collusion. And it means that society, which is the collectiveness, and the collusion doesn't want to know about abuse. They don't want to know about it. So it's swept under the carpet. It's part of our society's culture. Now, and it's pervasive. Thankfully, the Me Too, whatever that is, the Me Too movement, has helped a lot. But I was disappointed because it didn't, until recently, open the doors for domestic abuse. These women who came forward in Me Too, for the most part, also are very wealthy. When they were broke, when Gwyneth Paltrow was broke, she went along with Harvey Weinstein because she had to. Thank goodness, as she got to the point where she had some personal power, she had some backing, and she didn't need him anymore, she was able to come forward. Well, that doesn't happen in domestic abuse because, my example, we owned businesses. We had a terrific income. We lived in a big house. We had a swimming pool. We had boats. We had nice cars. We had all those things. And if I walk away, what am I going to have? Because I didn't get alimony. I didn't get any money from him. I wasn't willing to do that. I was too afraid to do that. So I moved into a tiny little furnished apartment. Well, collective collusion feeds right into that. It's all part of the same thing. It's pervasive.
So when we start talking about financial abuse, how does that fit with what we're talking about?
Financial abuse means primarily that the abuser, which I agree sometimes is the woman, but in my case, I speak of my abuser as a male because that's my situation. But the abuser controls the finances. And that was my case. When we were first married, now that was like 1968, a long time ago, but I was allowed $20. And I worked, but I turned my check over to him because that's how it had to be. And I got $20. And that was like what I was allowed to spend. And I remember my father-in-law at the time saying to my husband, "You can't just give her $20. She works. That's her money." And he said, "Not in this house. And it's none of your business." And it continued like that. That was, he just always controlled the money. And he had me convinced that I wasn't able to do that. I didn't understand money. I wasn't good with money. And he was. I agree with that. But it turns out that I'm pretty financially savvy.
Well, that's great.
So that's financial abuse. And there are women physicians and actors and people who make millions of dollars, and they don't have access to that. So that's another reason it's hard to leave. A lot of women don't leave abusive situations because they have no financial control. They have no financial security.
It's true. You don't have to give up on your relationship or settle for feeling lost or as if something is missing. You just need to know how to connect with your partner in a way that allows the two of you to feel loved and appreciated. But the problem is that many couples don't have the tools they need to navigate the ups and downs of a relationship without causing relationship injuries to one another. Yet they wonder what happened to the friendship that you used to share. How did it get from where it was in the beginning of the relationship to where you are now, feeling alone, disappointed, and hurt? And yet, you just can't seem to move forward to be happy again. Thankfully, this problem can be fixed, and that's where the 2 days and 7 conversation Hold Me Tight workshop comes in. Just 2 days, you will understand what you and your partner need to have a relationship where both of you are on the same page, working together to have that close relationship you only once dreamed of. Check it out at www.thecouplesexperts.com. Your relationship deserves the two of you feeling that closeness you once had. Well, I'm glad you mentioned a couple minutes ago that men sometimes are being abused as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What have you learned about the differences or similarities with when a man is the person being abused?
I don't really know much about that because my focus is women. And that's kind of been the place I've been. However, when I first started surviving abuse, I got an email from a young man. He was 24, I think. He said, "I'm 6'3". I'm built like a football player. I have a big heart, and I'm abused. My wife is 5'2". She's tiny. She's in great shape, but she will beat me to a pulp with belts or whatever she can get her hands on. And when I fight back or I call the police, she says that I started it. And who's going to believe a 5'2" over me?"
Right.
So it was heart-wrenching.
And the shame in something like that's got to be incredible.
It's got to be worse because men are the strong ones. They're the ones that protect us. And when you're abused by your spouse as a male, I can't imagine. I can't imagine. But that is not my area of
expertise.
Mm-hmm, right.
So before we stop, I do want to talk about one last question for you, which really is about the recovery piece. So many people have been in these situations, have been in these relationships, and then they get out, fortunately, and then they try to start a new relationship. What advice would you give someone who's coming out of these types of relationships on how to then move into having a healthy one? It must be a big challenge in a lot of ways.
It's a huge challenge. And my advice is personal growth. My catchline is, if we don't change, nothing changes. And if you can't look at yourself, look at your friends. You have friends who live in abuse, or you have friends, a more open conversation is alcoholism or drug addiction. So you have a friend who was married for years and years to an alcoholic. She finally says, "I can't deal with this," and she divorces him. And in 6 months, she's dating other alcoholics, and pretty soon she marries another one. And that doesn't work because it's all the same game. It's all the same stuff. And then she divorces him, and guess what? She marries another one. Well, what's the common denominator there? It's the woman who's choosing alcoholics. The same thing happens with any relationship, negative relationship, and it happens with abuse all the time. If we don't embrace some personal growth, read the books, go to the library and get them for free. There's a lot of online free information. Embrace personal growth, and whatever you do, resist going back to your abuser. And I put myself for 5 years in a repair shop because I knew the cycle. I knew that the common denominator for negative relationships is the person choosing that negative relationship partner. So I worked for 5 years. I took classes, I read books, I hired coaches, I hired therapists. And I'm going to say, I didn't have the money to do that. I left with virtually nothing. I didn't leave with the clothes on my back, but I left with virtually nothing. And even though I helped build that business for 34 years, I got nothing out of that either. So I was lucky enough to qualify for a credit card. And I say about credit cards, they're like a rope. They can hang you or they can pull you out of the mud. And I chose to use mine to pull me out of the mud. I didn't have the money to hire coaches and those things that I needed, but I knew if I didn't do it, my life would not evolve to the level that it could, that I would not live my authentic life. I would more than likely stay basically who I was, and I would end up in another abusive relationship or go back to the man I was married to for 34 years. So that's my advice. Embrace personal growth wherever you can find it. And if you don't have the money, I'm telling you, it's worth taking a second job to get it.
But there's also, I want to throw this in though, because I hear that and I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying, but I don't think it requires a second job. I think right now, with everything that's going on, for instance, your podcast, the network that you're involved with, there is a whole ton of free information, free support, Facebook groups. There are ways of getting this without needing a second job. The other thing I just want to make sure that no one is hearing it in this way, because I know definitely you're not saying this, but we're not talking about that as your fault.
Absolutely not.
Okay, and I just want to just highlight that nobody misunderstands this.
Yeah.
This is that the fault lays right where it does, which is on the perpetrator.
Exactly.
But what you're saying, which is I think so very important, is that if you take personal accountability to fix yourself, because we all the only one person we can change is ourselves.
Exactly.
And if you do that, then you will know if you're in an abusive environment in the future, because you would have done the work and not allowed yourself to get into that situation again, because you're now looking for a healthy partner.
I agree with you. And I agree primarily with what you said about not having to spend money. But I disagree in the fact that a coach or a therapist or a counselor, that person is invested in helping you see who you are. And we can't always see things about ourselves. In fact, I had a coach who said, and I was furious. I was so mad. She said, "What's your investment in being a victim?" Well, I didn't see myself as a victim, but I was. So if without her perspective, I would not have evolved as quickly as I did. I would have evolved. Right. But I think that's the benefit of having someone who is trained to really listen to what's being said behind the words, which you've done several times in this conversation.
Right.
You've heard what I've said without me saying the words. And that's, I think that's vital.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I think if you can do it, you do it, but you don't give up. You keep doing what you can do.
Exactly.
And I just want to thank you so very much for agreeing to give of yourself, your time, your experience to my listeners. I'm sure they've really benefited from this. If someone wants to get hold of you or want to continue a dialogue with you, would you let people know how they can do that?
Sure. Go to my website. It's survivingabusenetwork.com, survivingabusenetwork.com. There's a lot of information there, and there's also a contact me spot. So check that out. And I believe on there, and I believe what I offered to you, Stuart, for free for your listeners is my checklist of was I really abused? And I get that question asked so often, was I really abused? So it's a list of symptoms, of actions that if you can identify even one of those, I say, if you can identify one of those as something you lived with, then you were abused. Don't question yourself anymore, accept the reality.
And I want to thank you so much for giving that free to your audience. And thank you again for coming on. And we'll see you all next time on the Couples Expert Podcast. Take care now, and please stay connected. Bye-bye now.
Thank you for listening. This episode has ended, but your journey continues. Head over to www.thecouplesexperts.com to access all the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. Enjoyed this episode? Why not hit subscribe now and never miss an episode?